Hello, I'm Eugene Raikhel. I'm director of the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago, and I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's roundtable, China, Russia, and the Global Politics of COVID-19 Vaccines. Today's event is sponsored by the Centers for East Asian Studies, Eastern European and Russian Eurasian Studies, and Middle Eastern Studies, with generous support from the U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center grants. We will be sharing links to all of our websites in the chat box now, and we encourage you to visit these sites and sign up for our newsletters and listservs to learn more about our public events and outreach initiatives. And a big thanks to the staff members at these three centers who have worked on organizing today's events: Esther Peters, Abby Newman, Connie Yip, and Matthew Weflin. Before introducing our panelists and the topic we'll be discussing, I'd like to note that we will have time for questions towards the second half of today's discussion. Please enter your question at any time in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote questions from other attendees that you'd like to hear answered by our panelists. So today we will be discussing the global politics of COVID-19 vaccines with a focus on those vaccines developed in Russia and China. The past several months of the pandemic have, of course, been marked by a shift to massive vaccination campaigns following the approval of a range of vaccines, many of them developed and produced by multinational pharmaceutical corporations with significant government funding. Perhaps not surprisingly, the great proportion of these vaccines have been claimed by a relatively small number of wealthy countries, leading to a profound inequities in access globally. In today's webinar, we will discuss the role that COVID-19 vaccines developed in China and Russia are playing during this moment marked by widespread vaccine nationalism and by global efforts to ensure equitable access. Many of these particular vaccines are significantly cheaper to produce and easier to store and distribute, particularly in comparison with some of the newer mRNA vaccines. But for many of these vaccines produced in Russia and China, there have also been persistent questions and controversies surrounding the governance of clinical trials and approval mechanisms, questions of efficacy, issues of transparency surrounding data, and others. So today, we're going to discuss the political, economic, and institutional settings in which these vaccines have been produced and developed, as well as the role which these vaccines are playing both domestically in China and Russia and internationally in a kind of emerging world of pandemic global health diplomacy. I'm very pleased that we have with us three social scientists to speak to various aspects of this story: Judyth Twigg from Virginia Commonwealth University, Dali Yang from University of Chicago, and Olga Zvonareva from Maastricht University. We're going to start by giving each of our panelists about 10 minutes to give an introductory statement. After that, I'll pose some broad questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Our first speaker today is Judyth Twigg. She is a professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she teaches courses on global health, international political economy, and Russian politics. Her research focuses on issues of health, demographic change, and health systems reform in Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. She's also a senior associate with the Global Health Policy Center and Russian Eurasia program of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, consultant for the International Evaluation Group of the World Bank and Office of the Evaluation and Oversight of the Inter-American Development Bank, adjunct professor at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies at Georgetown University, and member of the Board of Trustees of the Eurasia Foundation. Welcome, Judy.
Thanks very much, Eugene. Thank you to the University of Chicago and the centers for the invitation to be with you today. Looking forward to learning a lot from the other speakers and from this discussion. In fact, I was just rereading Olga's book, Pharma Politics in Russia, this morning, and it's just essential background to understanding what's happening with Russian vaccine development. So looking forward to her remarks. So in the global vaccine race, Russia was clearly the first out of the gate. Sputnik V, V for victory, was the first COVID vaccine in the world to be approved by a national regulator back in August of 2020. And Russia has been aggressively marketing Sputnik V well before any of the Western vaccines had cleared regulatory approval. Sputnik V is now registered in 61 countries, and Nepal joined the list yesterday. And it's hard to keep up with that number because it seems to be going up on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. Countries from all over the world now have deals to receive Sputnik V doses straight from Russia. Even more are set to receive Sputnik V doses that are being manufactured somewhere else, China, India, South Korea, or they're set to receive the formula and the technology so that they can make Sputnik V themselves. So the central point that I want to make in my 10 minutes is that there's a huge contrast between the narrative that Russia has been spinning about Sputnik V and the reality on the ground. Russian propaganda has been full of exaggerations, misrepresentations about Sputnik V, and criticism and sometimes even disinformation about other vaccines, especially Pfizer. And this has in many ways undermined the credibility of what overall appears to be a safe, effective, good Sputnik V vaccine. And another point I want to make is that Russian production capacity has not been adequate to keep up with the promises that Russia has been making about its vaccine. So what is Russia's narrative here? Well, first of all, Russia clearly is using Sputnik V as a symbol of return to great power status. It's about pride, it's about national stature, it's about respect. Being first in the world to blaze the trail out of this once-in-a-century global pandemic puts Russia back on the map as a great scientific and technological power. And they've been portraying Sputnik V this way quite deliberately. And when Sputnik V was first approved last August, they launched the vaccine's website. And it had a feature where it took a couple of seconds for the website to load. There was a deliberately built-in delay. And during that delay, you just got a little button that said, turn your volume all the way up. And when you turned your volume up and pushed that button, what you heard was the audio of the beeps that we heard broadcast from space back in 1957, when the first Soviet satellite, Sputnik V, became the first man-made object in space. So that was a hallmark moment for Soviet superiority in the space race. And it's no accident that they're evoking that history now with naming the vaccine Sputnik V. Second, Russia clearly wants to exercise some soft power through Sputnik V. Poor and middle income countries are desperate for access to vaccines. Russia realizes that there is potential diplomatic benefit from appearing as a savior during this unprecedented global crisis. So Russia is highlighting contrasts. First, in how well countries have dealt with the pandemic. Throughout 2020, Russia liked to talk about how the United States, Western Europe, the supposedly superior democratic systems, how they couldn't get their COVID-19 cases under control, how they were still under lockdowns in many places, how their economies were suffering. While Russia came back after just one big lockdown in the spring of 2020, and now things look like they're completely back to normal. And so they paint Russia as the model to follow here. That's the storyline. It's one we heard in Putin's big speech earlier today. And in terms of vaccines, Russia is contrasting its own generosity against what it paints quite rightly as the selfishness of the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, gobbling up all the first available doses of Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca through pre-purchase agreements. The rich countries pre-purchased enough vaccine to cover their own people several times over, leaving the rest of the world for a very long time with nothing. And so Russia is deliberately highlighting these inequities and offering Sputnik V as the solution. So that's Russia's narrative. The reality on the ground is actually a little different. First, the way Russia proceeded with Sputnik V hasn't exactly inspired confidence. Both international consumers and Russian domestic consumers have lingering doubts about Sputnik V because it was approved before it had even entered large-scale clinical trials. I mean, they put the cart way before the horse. So there's a perception, and it's a correct perception, that development was rushed, that Sputnik V skipped the line, so to speak. It didn't go through a full scientific and regulatory vetting because of top-down political pressure to be first. And there's a fear that this may have impacted the vaccine's quality. So Putin was making a big gamble when he launched this vaccine before it was proven. Now, since then, Sputnik V's safety and efficacy have been verified, confirmed with results that have been published through peer review in The Lancet, an internationally respected journal. So it looks like Putin's gamble paid off, although there are new questions that have come up since then. The European Medicines Agency in particular is deliberately slow walking its review of Sputnik V, questioning whether its clinical trials met good clinical practice standards, because some of the military personnel and state employees who were subjects in the early trials have been described as having been under pressure to participate. And then there are some issues we can talk about later if people have questions that have happened in places like Slovakia, where there's inconsistency in what apparently are the Sputnik V doses that have been delivered to Slovakia versus what the doses that were actually used in the early clinical trials. So it's not clear what Sputnik V people are getting when they receive orders. These various stories and incidents are undermining the international credibility of the vaccine. And then there are doubts about Sputnik V within Russia itself. As of yesterday, Russia ranked 57th in the world, 57th in the world in the percentage of its population that's been vaccinated. Only 3% of the population has received both doses, and about 7.2% has received one dose. And it's a demand side problem. Russia is probably the only country in the world where supply exceeds demand. Moscow might be the only major city in the world where you can just walk in at multiple immunization stations, any shopping mall, and get the shot. If you go to GUM, the big luxury department store right off Red Square, you can get free ice cream if you walk up and get a Sputnik V vaccination. And there have never been limits. Anyone, any age, any occupation, despite the formal guidelines, anyone has pretty much been able to walk in and get this shot from the very beginning. So there are issues with vaccine hesitancy, vaccine refusal in Russia. A national poll taken in February of this year said that only 30% of people were ready to be vaccinated. 62% said no. So why is this the case? Well, lack in trust in government in general, and then a lack of trust in this specific vaccine because of the perception that it was rushed through development and approval. And there are also some widespread false beliefs about the pandemic itself. There's lots of conspiracy theory going around. In that February poll, 64% of people said they thought the virus had been deliberately created as a biological weapon. There's also just not much remaining of the coronavirus lockdown and restrictions in Moscow and in major big cities in the rest of Russia. So much of Russia seems back to business as usual. And so a lot of people are saying, why should I get a vaccine, risk side effects, risk complications, when it looks like the pandemic really isn't a big deal anymore. It's curious that the Russian government hasn't rolled out a bigger public communications campaign to try to overcome this vaccine hesitancy. Putin himself didn't get the shot until about a month ago, and he did it in private. He did it off camera. And he said he made that choice because he didn't want to parade around the cameras, make a big deal out of it. But that's ironic because Putin certainly hasn't been reluctant to create big splashy photo ops for himself in the past. Now, this looks like it's changing in the last couple of weeks. It looks like they're launching a bigger push. And in today's speech, a major national address, Putin announced some economic incentives, discounts on some public services for people over age 60 to get the shot. So it looks like they're moving a little more aggressive in this direction. Another point we want to make is that with Sputnik V, their action hasn't yet been able to catch up with the promises that they've made. There's a lot of noise about the number of countries whose regulators have approved Sputnik V, 61 of them, like I said earlier, but only 27 countries are actually using the shot. And from Russia's perspective, that might actually be a good thing because Russia's production capacity hasn't been able to meet global demand. They had trouble launching bioreactors, especially for the second dose back in the fall. There have been other production hurdles. It sounds like they've had some trouble getting some production equipment that they've needed that was only available in China. And so they've had to scramble to make production arrangements with third parties like India, like South Korea. Russia actually is now importing Sputnik V doses manufactured in South Korea for its own citizens to use. So a big question is how quickly Russia can scale up its own production to meet domestic demand. Last point I'll make here is that in terms of exports, very little of what Russia is doing so far is donations. So despite their propaganda about magnanimity, more of what they're doing is sales rather than donations. The list of countries that have made arrangements to receive Sputnik V, mostly in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Eastern and Central Europe. A lot of people are looking for political patterns here. You know, is Putin rewarding his friends, his fellow authoritarian leaders? Are they trying to make inroads into Latin America, the United States' backyard? But instead, the overarching pattern seems to be that they're exporting Sputnik V, not to poor countries, but instead to middle-income countries that have the capacity to pay. So there are very few arrangements for Sputnik V, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. For Russia, this looks a whole lot like a business opportunity. You know, COVID vaccines are a multi-billion-dollar business, and Russia obviously wants to maximize its market share. In fact, many of the 27 countries that have received and are using Sputnik V so far have gotten relatively small batches in the thousands or tens of thousands. These are essentially free samples. You know, they're token donations intended as marketing tools to get countries to buy at a larger scale. And I should just note that the price point for Sputnik V is reportedly about $20 for the full course of 2 doses. That's quite a bit cheaper, especially than the mRNA vaccines. It's cheaper than Pfizer or Moderna. But we should also note that these contracts aren't transparent, so we don't know the details of all the deals that have been made. So just wrapping up, the big picture is that Russia clearly approved Sputnik V early to get a first mover advantage. It's important to recognize that most of the countries that have taken delivery of Sputnik V have diversified vaccine portfolios. Almost no one is exclusively reliant on Russia. And so a big question that is worth asking now is whether or not Russia's window of diplomatic opportunity with their vaccine is closing. You know, for a while, Sputnik V had kind of a golden moment when it was pretty much the only game in town. Russia's vaccine generosity, its vaccine diplomacy was getting a lot of headlines. There's a question about whether that golden moment is passing and now being supplanted, you know, nudged aside by COVAX, the global vaccine facility, and by other bilateral deals from the United States and others that will help poor and middle-income countries. So as more vaccines become available globally, we should ask how explicitly this is going to turn into a competition. How much, for example, as more Western vaccines become available to poor and middle-income countries, will Western countries more openly advocate against procuring vaccines from adversary countries like China and Russia? Now, the big picture, the most important perspective right now, obviously, is that we just need to get as much good vaccine as we can get deployed as quickly as we can, no matter where they come from. And in that sense, it's unfortunate that the whole tenor of the conversation is frequently about competition rather than collaboration. And Russia makes this point all the time. You know, Sputnik V's official tagline is that it's the vaccine for all mankind. But that's a little disingenuous because Russia is saying this while it's clearly simultaneously touting the alleged superiority of its own product, and something that we can talk about in detail later, engaging in criticism and sometimes outright disinformation against the Western vaccines, essentially Pfizer. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute these opening thoughts. Back to you, Eugene.
Thanks so much, Judy. Our next panelist is Professor Dali Yang, who is William Claude Reavis Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He is the author of numerous books and scholarly articles on the politics and political economy of China. Among his books are Remaking the Chinese Leviathan, Market Transition and the Politics of Governance in China, published in 2004 by Stanford University Press, Beyond Beijing, Liberalization and the Regions in China, published in 1997 by Routledge, and Calamity and Reform in China, State, Rural Society, and Institutional Change Since the Great Leap Famine, published in 1996 by Stanford University Press. He's also editor of Discontented Miracle, Growth, Conflict, and Institutional Adaptations in China, and co-editor and contributor to Holding China Together, Diversity, and National Integration in Post-Deng China. Welcome, Professor Yang.
Thank you, Eugene. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to participate in this event. And also, I also want to thank the organizers and the staff in the centers for making this event possible. Professor Twigg's remarks are very instructive and very valuable in framing the overall context, as well as in discussing Russia's current development. In many ways, you can substitute China for Russia and get a variation of what is happening with regard to China and China's vaccine diplomacy. Of course, there's no Sputnik, unlike in the 1950s in that case. But at the same time, I think actually it's sort of this Sino-Russian kind of parallel is quite interesting. I do want to make a small number of points to get started. Number one, of course, is the issue of vaccine development. Number two is also the issue of clinical trials and use within China and how that relates to China's vaccine diplomacy. So the first issue is development. In fact, during the initial crisis in China, in terms of the, especially in Wuhan, there were quite a number of clinical trials of therapeutics. There were more than 200 registered, but most were not finished, in fact, as the crisis actually was tamed rather quickly within China in the global context, of course, in this case. And then, of course, the Chinese pharma companies, especially the vaccine makers, began to make a very strenuous push to develop Chinese vaccines very early on. And here is something very, actually, so sort of very simple to keep in mind. There are currently probably around 20 different vaccines that have been under development in China for COVID-19. But so far, it's Sinopharma, which has different branches or subsidiaries, and also Sinovac, a vaccine maker, a dedicated vaccine maker that have made the splashy headlines around the world, and especially within China. Casino and others have also been players, but they are much less significant at this point. And here is the paradox, however, because China was able to contain the pandemic within China relatively quickly, certainly by June. In fact, the vaccine makers in China had difficulty in getting clinical trials done in China. But before I further elaborate on this point, however, let's keep in mind, because the outbreak of the pandemic started in China, so initially, of course, China was the country that had the live virus, although you can go to Thailand and Japan and other places, presumably. But overall, though, Chinese vaccine makers, it's natural for them to think, well, let's do the classical, actually, sort of style of development, namely inactivated viruses, using inactivated viruses for vaccine development. It's a known strategy, it's safe, it's generally speaking, reasonably sure to succeed, especially given previous experiences in developing vaccines for SARS, which were never truly used, but nonetheless, experiences were accumulated during that time. Chinese scientists were also involved in developing vaccines for Ebola and also researching MERS. So again, a lot of those experiences were available in the process. So it's natural. And there was also, there were possibilities for Chinese developers to make use of the mRNA actually technology or platform. In fact, there was one company that did reach an agreement in Obil, in fact, to sort of for licensing and so on. But as you can imagine, especially in the January to March frame of 2020, Chinese leaders and manufacturers, they had natural questions about how the mRNA model would work, because it's never been fully implemented in the past, actually. And at the same time, they had all those experiences in developing the activated viruses. So by February, in fact, we already had developed the initial vaccines. We do not exactly know when exactly some of those vaccines were made available for emergency use. There was no big splash within China about that approval, about that use, but it was clearly made available fairly early on and quietly. And in fact, partly because some of the Chinese officials were working still very hard in Wuhan and so on. So there are people who are on the front lines of the battle against the pandemic within China that got the vaccines very early on in the clinical trial phase, not actually even in clinical trials, in the trial phase, let's put it this way, in that. But then as the pandemic subsided in China, however, the Chinese vaccine makers were left in a lurch because they could not finish the clinical trials in China. So that's when they began to turn to the UAE, to Brazil, and other countries. But they had no experience managing global clinical trials. And many of the corporate leaders in China were also, maybe they thought it's easy, you just issue an order or something, you can get it done. It turned out it's much more challenging, and especially because they had to measure up to the models that are set by, for example, the FDA. So therefore, so far, the major Chinese vaccines have still not been approved, for example, by the WHO for inclusion in the COVAX at this particular moment. So this is one thing. But however, there have been bilateral efforts, partly because those vaccines were conducting, the clinical trials were conducted in the Middle East, in Latin America, and so on. And therefore, in the process, those vaccine makers in China were able to make the vaccines available in those countries and sign deals as well, even while China actually was also making donations in the process. The two went hand in hand. Still, however, the challenge, as we know, those are good vaccines from a historical perspective. The only problem is that this time we had a new platform, namely the mRNA model, which has extraordinary efficacy numbers. And these are unprecedented because we do know, for example, for the flu vaccines and so on, they were not very reliable in the past. We've all taken them. So therefore, it's only in this particular context that the Chinese vaccines pale, and likewise in terms of other vaccines as well. So that's the situation. Now, the other aspect or major paradox for China is that because China was able to really contain the virus within China, quash it pretty much, then how do you get people, persuade them to get the vaccines to sort of, while they don't have the fear anymore? But the problem is China cannot fully open up without getting its people vaccinated. And yet, we also know that those vaccines may not last forever. They may only have efficacy, even when they are efficacious, so to speak. They may not be actually efficacious for a very extended time, and maybe half a year, maybe at most a year or something like that. So that means when you have 1.4 billion people, how long should this actually sort of, how this process should be carried out? Now, as the Pfizer and other vaccines become actually used so extensively, as Israel, the UK, and of course now the US are leading the way in achieving herd immunity, Therefore, China has to think of a strategy to open up by getting its people vaccinated. So over the last couple of months, China has been accelerated effort to do that. As of today, for example, there are 200 million shots that have been actually administered at this point. Now, before this current phase, Chinese manufacturers were making a lot of the doses available to other countries, whether it's Chile or actually countries in the Middle East. Now, as the Chinese demand rises, and some of it actually there is a lot of social pressure. So as a result, however, that has become more difficult within China to get the supplies. So this is another paradox that I want to end on in a way, and that also actually sort of makes it challenging for the Chinese leaders to balance the competing demands. I didn't realize 10 minutes is so short in many ways, sort of. But overall, the situation for the Chinese leadership to balance the domestic and the international, and while at the same time managing this opening up. But in fact, I think there is increasingly concern that China may not be able to open up before the Beijing Olympics in February 2022. So let me stop here and turn it over back to our moderator.
Thank you so much. Our third panelist, Olga Zvonareva, is Assistant Professor of Health, Ethics, and Society at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, as well as an Associate Professor at the Siberian State Medical University and Tomsk State University in Russia. She's author of the recently published book, Pharma Politics in Russia, Making Drugs and Rebuilding the Nation, and co-editor of the edited volume, Health Technologies and Politics in Post-Soviet Settings, Navigating Uncertainties. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Eugene. And thank you to organizers and everyone who made this event possible. It's exciting to be a part of this conversation, and I hope we continue it further after the event as well. I would like to build on what has already been said and discuss relationships between vaccines and politics more general. It is absolutely certain, of course, that there is widespread uneasiness about Sputnik V vaccine. And I would like to start this conversation about vaccines and politics from this example that was already very well described. We certainly know that its release in Russia was done ahead of completing clinical trials. Its approval occurred on the basis of quite scant and poor quality data. And this move invited criticisms of political interference by the state in the matters of science and technology. So here, Russian state, it seems to claim sovereignty with regards to how new technologies are developed and how they are studied. It is commonly expected that such interference introduces bias into knowledge production, and such interference curbs innovation by forcing scientists to make decisions not on the basis of scientific facts, but on the basis of various non-scientific considerations. And yeah, by the way, such criticisms are very much similar to familiar and popular accounts of Soviet science. In these accounts, non-democratic state dictated scientists what to do and how. And this dictating is very much contrary to the idea of science and is detrimental to scientific progress. So this perhaps is the main source of uneasiness about Sputnik vaccine now. The state taking matters of science and technology into its, political hands. Now, strangely enough, this debate takes place in relative isolation from another debate about safety and efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines produced by multinational pharmaceutical companies. This second debate is quite fierce as well. The pharmaceutical industry has long been accused of a number of things, including curation of medical knowledge through ghostwriting, medical journal articles, and through building unduly close relationships with key opinion leaders who educate practicing physicians about drugs. Now, in the midst of global pandemic, all these questions with regards to credibility of industry-produced knowledge are being asked again. Are endpoints in vaccine trials selected to maximize chances of regulatory approval rather than to provide meaningful information for decision-making? Or are cases excluded from efficacy analysis? Are they excluded to make relative risk reduction more impressive than it actually is? And most importantly, and this question is being asked again and again, when will we have access to raw, that is patient level, trial data that would permit independent analysis? Many stakeholders in public health have demanded access to this kind of raw data from trials of biopharmaceuticals for years. But multinational pharmaceutical industry has used its power to resist any attempt to subject its research to public scrutiny, which led some people, some commentators to doubt the trustworthiness of industry claims. That's the second point. But then a third kind of vantage point from which we can think about relationships between vaccines and politics is, it's science, however broadly it sounds itself, right? When speaking about politics of vaccines and medical technologies, we can take a look at practices of scientists themselves, and we notice very similar claims to sovereignty as in the cases of states and industry that we just discussed, right? Scientists decide what research is needed, is warranted currently, and how to conduct it, and they guard their authority to independently make such decisions. Yeah, for the sake of brevity, I'm speaking in a very broad strokes, but pattern is clearly discernible. Concerns raised by outsiders, people outside science, they tend to be dismissed as ignorant, while uncertainty inherent to science is contained to prevent it and doubts from leaking out. When such leaks inevitably occur, then conflicts over authority, they escalate. Outsiders, they think of deliberate manipulations and even deception by scientists, and scientists mobilize against the threat of interference by outsiders, by those unfamiliar with science and scientific method. So in a way, political role of Russian vaccine is not that different from roles of other industry and academia developed vaccines. It shows total, I can say this, I guess, inadequacy of how we conceive relationships between politics and biomedical innovations. In this sense, state efforts to govern innovations, industry profit pursuing practices, and science's very own quest for authority are not all that different. We expect that vaccines and biomedical innovations more generally need to be safeguarded from politics for publics to receive safe and effective treatments. But maybe, and this is something that I would like to pose as claim and invitation for discussion, but maybe this is impossible and unreasonable. A question that needs to be answered is not how to safeguard biomedical innovating from politics, but rather how to respond to these interconnections between vaccines and politics in a transparent and equitable way. I see that I have three more minutes, but maybe we can use it in general discussion.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So we will now move into the discussion and Q&A section of our webinar, and we have a few questions that have come in already. We'll try to get to all of these. And I just wanted to encourage everyone in the audience to continue entering your questions into the Q&A box, and then if you'd like, upvote those questions which have already been raised. Maybe a good place to start this is just to see if any of the other panelists have a response to the kind of provocation that Olga just posed about the kind of framing of how we think about the relationship between state, market, and science in our discussions, in our analyses of pharmaceuticals and healthcare politics in general. If that isn't too big of a question.
Well, I could get started by simply emphasizing when it comes to vaccines in particular, the usual rules about the market may not exactly work because of the uncertainties of developing vaccines and the cost of doing so upfront and the uncertainties of doing so when the pandemic, you don't know what course is going to follow. Was it going to be SARS in 2003 when the pandemic, there wasn't a pandemic, it ended and disappeared, and all the investments essentially could not produce any real tangible benefits in the short run, versus really a drug that's designed to deal with, for example, long-lasting chronic disease or something like that. So this is where, and of course, this is where Kramer and others have made the arguments really for government involvement and Operation Warp Speed, for example, is justified in that sense. And likewise, in the Chinese case, for example, initially in the developing of the vaccines, the Chinese CDC made available its own lab space for the pharma developers because they did not have the kind of safe labs available at that particular moment and so on to give it a leg ahead. But again, though, this commitment is massive, and therefore the usual thoughts about the state and market have to be balanced about the issues of externalities, sunk costs, and also not only negative externalities, but also positive externalities as well.
If I could jump in and just make a comment about Russia, 2 points. One is that for quite a while now, there have been national pharmaceutical development strategies in place in Russia that have been explicitly and aggressively import substitution strategies, where the state is creating incentives for Russian pharmaceutical developers throughout the vertical chain to sort of reacquire market share from the international pharmaceutical companies that moved so aggressively into the Russian market back in the late 90s and early 2000s. One of the explicit goals of what was a Pharma 2020 strategy and is now a follow-on strategy to the Pharma 2020 document is for Russia to increase its market share in international pharmaceutical markets, where it had not traditionally been a major player outside of the near abroad, the former Soviet space. And so I will not be surprised if, as time goes on, Russia tries to capitalize on whatever success it experiences with the global marketing of Sputnik V to try to create niches for its other pharmaceutical products on international markets as well. In terms of the relationship between the state and science and pharmaceutical development inside Russia, I'll also note that there's quite a bit of institutional competition, much of which is opaque to us inside the Russian institutional landscape. So in terms of the development of early on in the pandemic, COVID-19 tests and test kits, and now with the development of vaccines, we appear to have a situation where individual scientific research institutes have alliances with particular Russian government structures, some with the Ministry of Health, some with Rospotrebnadzor, which is the Russian consumer affairs regulator. And so there's a lot of internal bureaucratic competition between these government agencies that ends up playing out with both financial and political priority that are afforded to different test kit developers, different vaccine developers.
Well, could I add, Olga, I'll defer to you.
Okay.
Actually, what I was going to say was more a response to Professor Yang. So I don't know, maybe I should then wait till.
Okay, well, in that case, I simply want to add, especially in contrast to Russia, is the fact that even when the state sector is involved in China, there are multiple players that are in competition. And in fact, Sinopharma itself have subsidiaries actually that are in competition internally in some way. So that's very important. And then you do have vaccine makers, for example, that are not state-owned, that are also listed on, all of them are listed on stock markets and so on. And they also, and one of the things is there has been complaints about mRNA as a model initially, but in fact, lately, China has become muted, partly because Chinese vaccine makers are also adapting the platform for China now. So they own it partly. So therefore, this internal competition is very important in this particular case in thinking about China, that is not simply that they are betting just on one thing. They have multiple horses, and therefore the national government would not simply say pick one or the other. In fact, they have to allow for that competition. And also partly because they bet on multiple models because they didn't know which ones would be working.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead. Okay.
So yeah, I would like to just briefly agree with Professor Twigg. It's absolutely very fair and very reflective description of this Russian pharmaceutical landscape, and it probably will help us to understand its reaction to emergency situation. And this is what triggered me in the previous statements, is how the situation of emergency changes immediately the political possibilities in terms of how medical technologies, vaccines in particular, are developed and promoted. For example, we can safely say that pharmaceutical technologies, clinical trials have been the most heavily regulated field globally for quite some decades. With the arrival of COVID, at the very least in Russia, everything changed, right? Before that, for 10 years, we could not think about disregarding good clinical practice guidelines or research ethics foundations that prohibit us to experiment or invite into experimentation people who are in some kind of dependent position in relation to leaders of medical experimentation. So what do we see? Employees of organization that is being in the lead of vaccine development are being invited to be a part of clinical trials. Next thing we see is soldiers are being invited into the clinical trials. Next again, we see that before anything has been reviewed and made public, vaccine is being approved. And then the question is how justifiable these actions are, even given the emergency situation. To what extent emergency situation can be an excuse for changing political decisions reached in previous, perhaps more calm, more deliberative stage of our world.
May I ask Olga a question specific to the Russian situation to follow up on that? Your question about how fair it is to criticize the extent to which Russia bypassed regulatory norms, I think is an interesting one, particularly since the approval came on August 11th. And obviously there are issues about whether or not there was any kind of pressure or even coercion on certain vulnerable groups to participate in the clinical trials. But in fact, they didn't actually get around to anything resembling mass distribution of this vaccine until November, maybe even December. And so they had a chance to accumulate some phase 3 data before they started mass vaccination. So I'll couple that observation with an observation also that the second and third vaccines in Russia, the one from Novosibirsk, the vector Institute, and then the third vaccine from Moscow's Chumakov Center have also been approved by the regulator far before they've even entered phase 3 clinical trials. And I wonder whether in some cases we're just observing in this emergency situation a sort of, flexibility, if you will, with the word approval and the meaning, the formal meaning of regulatory approval. But in fact, the actions that they've taken in terms of administration in the vaccine haven't broken established norms to the extent that the date of formal approval has. That's what they would claim. Is that a fair observation?
On one hand, yes, of course, these are the facts. To what extent this is a deliberate strategy, I am divided. We cannot know, and I think there is a decent chance of vaccine not being mass distributed, not because of someone's decision, but rather because of weakness of distribution channels, this not being a priority in comparison to launching vaccine into the international markets, etc. Because why I'm saying this is we have an example of a drug, which, this is not a vaccine, but it may give us a good sense of how medical drugs can be distributed. So hydroxychloroquine, I'm not sure how it's pronounced in English, but I think it's recognizable in my Russian accent. Moscow Department of Healthcare has launched a prevention/clinical trials program for physicians that are working in public healthcare organizations in Moscow with hydroxychloroquine at the time when we already knew that this drug does nothing if not harming people who are in touch with COVID-19 or are sick with COVID-19. And then the information about this program was altering between, well, it is a clinical trial, we are collecting data and then we will know, to, this is a prevention program. So we are giving it to help you, so take it right away. And this, boundary between clinical research and clinical care was completely erased. And since this population was available for distribution of this medical substance, they did receive it with purposes that I'm still not clear about. So I'm not sure exactly how deliberate the decision was about the vaccine.
So these are really great. I'm glad that we're moving ahead with some discussions here. I'm going to start pulling in some of the questions that are coming in from the audience members, and there's a number of them. So Helen Tilley has asked a number of questions, but one she's raised to all of the panelists is, how would you say that domestic patent rules in Russia and China have affected vaccine development and multilateral agreements? Anybody have thoughts on that? Or maybe more generally, sort of the regulatory environment and world domestically in Russia and China?
Well, with regard to China, may I add, China has generally respected the IPR rules related to drugs in particular, and it's been relatively hesitant in developing, even though it's been trying to develop generics, for example. But in terms of vaccines, for example, because of the time pressure and so on, so there has not been any issues related to patent or other infringements, and Chinese manufacturers have signed deals, for example, with Moderna and BioNTech to manufacture jointly and so on. So in essence, China has played by the rules, generally speaking, although there have been concerns, for example, as we heard about reports in particular of potential, for example, web hacking and so on, but really we have no details about what exactly was going on in those cases. But we do know, for example, that there are 2 manufacturers in China that have been working on joint ventures or certainly partnerships with BioNTech and Moderna, and maybe other, there are others as well, actually, so sort of in this case.
I'll defer to Olga on this question. My understanding is that it really hasn't been much of an issue in Russia. They've played by the rules as well. They are engaging in some international partnerships or have talked about engagement in international partnerships, especially with AstraZeneca, which is also an antiviral platform. And there's talk about partnering with AZ in order to experiment with combining 1 dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine with 1 dose of Sputnik V. Where the conversation about intellectual property rights has been most potent in Russia is in the, I don't want to call it disinformation, but in the aggressive negative campaign that Russian state media and social media has engaged in criticizing the Western countries for not loosening up the regime and making their vaccines more available to the rest of the world.
Olga, did you want to jump in with this question at all, or?
Yeah, well, maybe I will pass. I agree with what is already said. Okay. It's, yeah, I haven't seen blatant violations, although Russian media are famous for claiming that it is necessary to break patent law to get access to various life-saving medicines, for example, HIV antiretrovirals, but I haven't seen such claims with regards to vaccines.
Great. I just wanted to follow up. Helen Tilley also had another question for you, Dali, and this is refers to these reports of hacking of vaccine research in the U.S. that were coming out in spring and summer of 2020. And she's asking how much of this is US propaganda, how much real developments, and what kind of transnational sharing was going on in spite of stark vaccine nationalism in the US.
Well, my sense is I would not be surprised that there was some real hacking. Whether those hacking really helped the manufacturers, that's a different issue. But at the same time, I think much of it was probably at that point, there was so much uncertainty. So it's really a strategy by different countries to get a sense of what's happening. And also, especially as the MIA model became, our platform became actually highly prominent over time. So you can imagine state interests in China were becoming somewhat concerned. And in some sense, we do know that there has been some disinformation at one point against the platform until and as I predicted in many ways, the Chinese manufacturers themselves began to embrace it. And then, of course, we have to turn around and say, this is actually something very, very good. So there has been that process. And I think to what extent is, yeah, so sort of there are issues of shadows, interest, and so on. Given how many interests get involved, it's hard for us to truly know. And in fact, even the people who write on that, I mean, they can make guesstimates at the best.
That's great. Thank you. We have a number of other questions that are quite specific, but before we get to those, I wanted to ask another maybe broader framing question, partly about kind of historical framings and legacies. You know, I think often in this discussion in the last 6 months around vaccine nationalism and kind of races for vaccines, there's a lot of Cold War rhetoric that keeps coming up. But as a number of people have pointed out, there's a kind of irony to the fact that if we take the example of the poliovirus vaccine, developed in the height of the Cold War, there was actually quite a bit of cooperation, at least among scientists and clinical researchers, around the Sabin live attenuated vaccine between researchers in the US and the Soviet Union. So maybe for our audience, just a way to get around that is to, how do you generally account for that kind of what seems like in some ways a paradox, right? That we're in this moment, that we're seeing more competition, more vaccine nationalism at this moment today. What is it that accounts for that difference? With the caveat that it's obviously difficult to make these kind of historical comparisons. Olga, do you want to?
Yeah, I am not sure that we really see that much of discontinuation, to be honest. So yeah, if we look at, again, the Cold War that you mentioned, medicine was indeed one of the fields where the struggles, they had been intense. In the US, pharmaceuticals, yeah, became a weapon to win loyalty of nations that were called developing and nations who haven't decided about their side in this global struggle between capitalism and communism. And the US politicians, they argued for employing pharmaceuticals to free people from disease and communist threat. And then American pharmaceutical industry was central for this efforts, and yeah, it was also simultaneously to disseminate the idea of free enterprise. And then the USSR side, in turn, it relied on its socialized healthcare system, not pharmaceuticals so much, because yeah, it was maybe less impressive. And yes, Soviet socialized healthcare system was to do similar work of transmitting the message of superiority of the Soviet society to other kinds of societies. So this is what was presented as a healthcare system that for the first time was delivering comprehensive care for free and to everyone. And it was there also to, yes, disseminate the Soviet vision of society. Vaccines nowadays, they seem to be perceived and act similarly. One thing that may be different is the degree of professional independence. So I would say that previous contacts, amidst all this that was happening during the Cold War between scientists, between maybe medical professionals, they were due to a relative independence. Okay, maybe it's not very fair to say about medical professionals, but at least about scientists. Scientists, some of them, at least some group of scientists, they enjoyed more professional independence. Their bodies were more independent in Russia, in Soviet Union, I mean, and they had more leeway in making decisions how they are collaborating and why and with who. And in many cases, the political decision makers were informed already afterwards when the cooperations were on the way. I do not think it is possible anymore.
Well, let me add, I think partly what we are witnessing is actually developments within a global emergency. And in an emergency situation, some of the animosities, the sense of we retreat, communities retreat to their own communities in a way, nations retreat to the protective shell of nationalism. And of course, the media tends to pay attention to these salient issues in the short run at a time of emergency, and also, of course, of scarcity, because of course supply is not adequate for the moment. But of course, we are that equation, that those kind of situations is going to turn, and it's actually at the same time the sentiments are also beginning to turn. I think, in the sense that countries will recognize, and partly, of course, we also already have seen in the US also the change in national leadership and so on, in the sense of the relationship to the WHO, to COVAX. But most importantly, scientists and policymakers realize that a pandemic does not stop globally is not going to help you even if you just get vaccinated, because the mutations are going to overcome your vaccines, and you have to keep running in a way. And I think countries, therefore, such as the United States, China, or Russia, presumably, and hopefully India at some point, so sort of, because India, of course, is in the throes of a major new wave now, we'll realize that they really do need to work together to contain, certainly to moderate this pandemic over time, as they try to update the vaccines to adapt to the mutations and so on. And within China itself also, there has been some discussion of those kind of issues. Again, it relates to the global, the public goods aspect of the vaccines and so on. But at the same time, just getting yourself vaccinated is not enough because there are going to be mutations that are going to spread. And I think increasingly countries have to recognize that. I do want to bring back a little fact, and in fact, given that this is an event organized by the centers at the University of Chicago, let me mention that a UChicago alum, Maurice Hillerman, truly was such a significant leader in developing so many different vaccines, made them available, including one on hepatitis B, made at Merck, in fact, which was practically given to China for $1 million in the 1990s when China was short of money at that point. It saved numerous lives in China, really saved a generation of people who were ravaged by hepatitis at that point. And now, of course, we have 2 generations now practically who are relatively free of hepatitis B. So in that sense, there are those kind of developments, even that's, of course, post-Cold War in a way. So there are ideas do matter, ideas about collaboration and cooperation do matter. And it's very important to remind political leaders that vaccine nationalism may sound and may feel good in the short run, but it's not up to really up to the task of containing a global pandemic.
Judy?
These are great points. And just to add a couple of observations to build on what's already been said. One is that I think in the current crisis situation, and as it evolves in the coming months and years, it's useful to distinguish between collaboration among scientists and collaboration in something like vaccine production and distribution, which inherently brings in private sector, profit-motivated interests, and also the political interests related to foreign policy, vaccine diplomacy that have already been highlighted. In terms of just collaboration between scientists doing basic science on epidemiology, virology, public health, it's remarkable how between the United States and Russia, even over the last 8 to 10 years, when the bilateral political relationship has deteriorated so dramatically, there's still it's a relatively small, but an important set of flourishing and robust set of scientific partnerships between American research teams and Russian research teams, many of them still funded generously by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And ironically, they're in areas that you might think at first glance are relatively politically sensitive in the Russian context. So they're in areas like addiction, HIV/AIDS, opioid and other kinds of drug use, fetal alcohol syndrome. And yet somehow those partnerships have managed to fly under the radar in some senses and continue to thrive. So there's still ongoing scientist to scientist collaboration that I think is important. In terms of broader collaboration for tackling the pandemic in a more publicly visible way, I'll note that there was an agreement signed between the Russian Academy of Sciences and the American National Institutes or National Academies of Engineering and Medicine last summer, precisely for this, for collaboration on, in the global effort to tackle the pandemic. Exactly nothing has been done to follow up on that agreement, but those academies did find a possibility to sign the agreement. And now there are a lot of people asking whether the potential for eventual collaboration to tackle the pandemic might become more real with a new American presidential administration, and as the Biden administration puts its Russia team together. And obviously, again, the bigger picture bilateral political relationship is probably at its lowest levels since for many years. And yet there's some speculation that as things move forward, if we try to get into a process of some sort of de-escalation of the war of words that we're engaging in with Russia right now, if there might be channels that both sides would look to for demonstration that collaboration is possible, certainly collaboration against a once-in-a-century global pandemic should be an area where there's fertile ground for that kind of discussion.
Wonderful. I'm going to move now to a question from the audience. Tatiana Chudakova thanks everyone for fascinating presentations and asks the speakers to speak a bit more about other vaccines under development, both in Russia and China, asking what role they might be playing both in national vaccination outreach and on the international stage, meaning other than the prominent ones that we've discussed. She says specifically she's thinking of the Novosibirsk vector vaccine, as well as the one developed by the Chumakov Center. They have somewhat different mechanisms of immunization. Does this play a role in terms of which vaccines are more actively promoted on the international stage? So question for everyone, and maybe Dali, you could also speak about some of the other vaccines being developed or close to approval in China as well.
Well, let me emphasize, none of the vaccines has been fully approved so far. They are all approved for emergency use only at this point. And of course, the process has also underscored the uncertainties, right? So sort of you look at the struggles that AstraZeneca has had with the Oxford vaccine. You also see the failures tactically of Merck, which has traditionally been such a good, strong leader in vaccine development, and yet giving up on both of its vaccine candidates. So in many ways, actually, this is a very highly uncertain process. And in the process, as information becomes available, some are going to become less attractive, including the activated models now. But at the same time, we clearly see that the mRNA model becoming actually the winner in the process. There are the others, of course, including the recombinant DNA and so on. But in generally speaking, this is actually almost like there is an evolutionary process to some extent, so sort of the vaccine makers developing, adopting different models. But at the same time, the marketplace in some ways through more transparent information, because vaccine makers now, including the Chinese ones, for example, they have to make some information available. They are both initially just do not pass muster in the age of social media and so on. And of course, the Chinese government, the party state has actually censored some of the potential reports about adverse reactions and so on, but that actually has discouraged people from accepting the vaccine even more. So therefore, any vaccine maker that comes up with more transparent, more efficacious product, namely, in this case, we have the newer models, they are going to be winning over the long haul. So it's not just nations, actually nations may recede in the process. It's the different models of vaccine development that become very important, especially as production capacity ramps up, and they are ramping up at this point.
Olga and Judyth, would you like to speak to the Chumakov or vector vaccines in Russia?
Please go ahead, Olga.
Oh, okay, well, we basically, which vaccine is available for mass vaccination? For which vaccine do we have most data? Which vaccine is being most discussed? So in comparison to Sputnik vaccine, other ones, they look like they are performing a role of, I don't know, kind of statists or something of that kind. There are claims made about some other vaccine being mild, more appropriate for elderly. But it is not clear based on which data these claims are being made, because the only publication with regards to, I may be confusing here, but I think it is about vector vaccine we have is in a Russian language journal with, very unclear data. So I think that these vaccines will continue to be around, but they probably are not going to ascend to any equal footing with Sputnik.
In terms of international marketing of the vaccine, Russia is clearly putting all of its eggs in the Sputnik V basket. Sputnik V, as far as I know, is the only COVID vaccine in the world that has its own Twitter account and other social media accounts. And they hired a public relations firm in London to run these social media accounts, and then they're worth a look. It's really quite extraordinary, especially recently, how the Sputnik V Twitter account has become more and more aggressive in criticizing the other vaccines that are available internationally, and especially the Western vaccines, and they really have it in for Pfizer for some reason. It's an extraordinary amount of criticism of Pfizer's vaccine. So it's a deliberate setting up of a competitive situation between the vaccines. In terms of the data that are available within Russia and externally about the Russian-produced vaccines, there is a lack of good data on what lies behind these vaccines, just even in terms of how many people in Russia have received any COVID-19 vaccine. There are various estimates that are given by various institutions in Russia, but they claim that they will not release exact numbers because the vaccine records are kept in a Ministry of Health data set, and it would be violating patient confidentiality to release any kind of exact numbers or any kind of time series data about who's been vaccinated when. And it's not clear at all to me how releasing aggregate numbers is any kind of violation of patient privacy. I mean, we have stringent patient privacy, HIPAA regulations in the United States, and yet there's no problem with local, state, national level release of data on how many people are being vaccinated overall, today, last week, last month. And so it seems to me that this is a lot of excuse making by Russian authorities for whatever reason to not release full data, even on something that should be as relatively straightforward as counting numbers of people who have been vaccinated. In terms of relative efficacy, there's been quite the drama around the vector vaccine, Epivac Corona, it's called. There was a group of people who were involved in the early stages of clinical trials with that vaccine last fall, who went out and did their own independent testing. They paid for their own tests to find out whether or not they had developed antibodies. And many of them found that they had developed no antibodies at all. And they got together at first on a closed Telegram channel on social media and were kind of comparing their own test results. And they finally sent a public letter to the Vector Institute asking what the deal was with what seemed to be a poor performing vaccine. And the Vector Institute came back with a response that in fact, the publicly available tests for antibodies wouldn't pick up antibody production that had been derived from the vector vaccine, that antibodies could only be detected through a special test that was only available from the Vector Institute itself. And so that's an interesting story about testing for antibodies. And so it's illustrative of the difficulties that the Russian research and clinical establishment is having in presenting internationally acceptable data on what's happening at multiple levels of the process there.
We have a question from Zach Wittes, who asks, has Russian and Chinese vaccine diplomacy been effective in improving the opinions of other countries' citizens towards Russia and China? Has there been any polling of Chileans since the arrival of Chinese vaccines in Middle Eastern countries? So this is a question for all the panelists. I know, Judy, you suggested that some of the seeming vaccine diplomacy might just be business or driven more by business kind of strategies. Does anyone want to speak to this question?
Well, I could get started since Judy was just talking. Of course, we do know public opinion about China in the West has plummeted over the last year and a half, right? In Europe, in the US, and so on. And a lot of it relates to broader issues, but including the management of the responses to the initial outbreak, and also various other issues, including the current tussle with the WHO related to the mission to China. Of course, we don't have time to go into all of those. But at the same time, as China itself was able to contain the virus within, so they had the wherewithal, the resources, and also the capacity to help countries in need. When we have the US, for example, signing up for 600 million doses or more of vaccines, but making them, even when we have AstraZeneca vaccine that's actually not approved in the US, we are still holding it. Of course, that's not going to get the US goodwill in some of those countries that are in dire need. And that's where China comes in, Russia comes in. And of course, it helps, definitely. But of course, sometimes the situation can be overplayed, because when China presents it as if it's the severe, it gets the health minister, the prime minister to go to the airport to welcome the vaccine sometimes. There is a little pageantry in there. But then, of course, there has to be bound to be some disappointment when the Chinese vaccines are not being seen as effective. Right? Whether in the UAE, they are considering a third dose for some of the takers and so on. And in that sense, actually, clearly it's a mixed bag. But overall, though, China has been very consistent over the last year in particular in making available resources, including PPEs, including vaccines to countries that are in need in the developing world. And it helps to alleviate some of the tension, some of the issues. And at the same time, Chinese demand for actually raw materials and other things have gone up, and that helps actually overall as well, even while China has been very tough on countries that have been critical of China, and namely, especially Australia in this case. So it's a little mixed, but overall, though, it helps. And we do have some numbers. So you look at the, for example, Ipsos and so on, numbers, it does show, again, those are long-standing divided opinions of China around the world.
Russia has definitely made some inroads with public opinion in some of the countries that have received relatively large numbers of Sputnik V. Argentina, for example, shows a pretty big pro-Russia public opinion bump. Mexico, to some extent. When you look at the impact on public opinion in some of the Central and East European countries where Russia is truly trying to sort of drive a wedge into the European Union, try to get some EU member states to approve and use Sputnik V before it's been approved by the European Medicines Agency, the EU regulator, here you see public opinion pretty evenly divided between pro-Russian and anti-Russian public opinion groups that had already been established. I think that the point about the unquestionable selfishness of the rich Western countries having bought so many vaccines in advance and now hoarding them when they really don't need to be. And the example of the United States and the AstraZeneca vaccine is a prime example. I wonder what the long-term effect of these current actions is. And that's why I posed the question in my initial remarks about whether or not this Russian golden moment and this Chinese golden moment as the only game in town for a lot of the poor and middle income countries, whether or not that's a set of public opinion figures that might be likely to last. because as COVAX rolls out, and clearly that rollout is accelerating now, and we're starting to see the United States giving some of its excess doses to Mexico, and I think we'll see much more bilateral activity with the United States and other countries as the months go on. Whether or not in the long term, people are going to have long memories about where their vaccines came from, and particularly as we get into 2022, 2023, people start to need booster doses, or as Dali has described, as the mRNA vaccines clearly emerge as the winners in terms of the effectiveness of the vaccine technology. And both the Western countries and the Western-backed global health institutions like WHO, like the World Bank, the other IFIs, as those become more dominant as the global providers of vaccine, does that set of circumstances overwhelm any lingering memories of the early, if you will, advantage that Russia and China had?
Great. Olga?
And I would like to add to this that possible, success, possible impacts of Russian vaccine diplomacy are being hindered, and probably in the future will be hindered more by problems with transparency. Because if we look at such simple numbers as numbers of COVID deaths, it seems not exactly directly related to COVID vaccine, but it all adds up, right? So if we look at Russia reported numbers of COVID deaths, we see number of 0.04% of the population, right? They died in 2020 from COVID-19. Then we look at excess deaths that was recently calculated. I think the study was published in February. And then when we look at excess deaths, we see the number of 0.18%. And in itself, it is not very surprising because for all countries, number of excess deaths are more than number of officially reported deaths. But Russia still stands out because this ratio of excess mortality, excess deaths in relation to officially reported deaths is 6.5. So this is the largest ratio. And this means that on one hand, of course, Russia COVID-19 mortality is higher than officially reported, but it is not so interesting. What is most interesting is that Russian numbers appear to be the least trustworthy. So this all adds up and holds with other kinds of data as well. And in the long term, cannot be supportive of this vaccine diplomacy efforts. And it is a shame because things could have been otherwise, be there more trust.
Thank you so much. Well, at this point, unfortunately, we're out of time. But I want to thank again all of our panelists for some really wonderful insights into this discussion. Thank our attendees, and again, the centers that have, and the center staff that helped to make today's event possible. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.